Hello, my name is Josiah Hardy, and this is my final presentation for English 102. My topic is Never Confronting Injustice, How Macomb's Prejudice and Atticus Finch's Morality Shaped Scout's Coming of Age. Harper Lee, born April 28, 1926, in Monroeville, Alabama, was raised in a small town. Her father was a lawyer and served as a clear inspiration for her character Atticus Finch. Her upbringing during the Great Depression in a racially segregated town deeply influenced the themes of racial injustice, moral integrity, and empathy that appear in her novel. She studied law at the University of Alabama, but left before finishing to pursue writing in New York City. There, she worked with the editor, Tay Hohoff, to revise what eventually became her only published novel for decades, To Kill a Mockingbird. The book won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 1961 and quickly became a cornerstone of American literature. Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird is more than a denunciation of racism and injustice in the American South, but also an exploration of childhood and moral growth in the context of normalized prejudice. It is about Scout Finch, a little girl who resides in the fictional town of Macomb, Alabama during the Great Depression, a town plagued with social obstacles, racial discrimination, and a silence towards standing against injustice. From the point of view of Scout, readers observe how a child begins to make sense of a world that most of the time seems to be one-sided and divergent. Her moral education is centered around her father, Atticus Finch, who is a lawyer and defends a wrongly accused black man, Tom Robinson, in the face of public disapproval. Atticus does not simply preach values of justice and compassion, he lives them, setting Scout an example of courage and integrity. This speech will explore the way Scout's coming of age is conditioned by two intense and conflicting powers: the refusal of the people to confront their own unfairness, and Atticus's unwavering certainty of doing what is right even when it is unpopular and dangerous. As she witnesses the deterioration of her world and the strength of her father's moral framework, Scout learns the value of the complexity of a human nature and the importance of struggling for what is right. Her transformation teaches the moral development often begins not with heroic acts, but with the small action of being a witness to a cruelty and benevolence. To Kill a Mockingbird was set in the Jim Crow era during the 1930s, a time when racism was not only a cultural norm, but also legally enforced through segregation and discriminatory laws. Harper Lee drew heavily from her own experiences growing up in Alabama. One of the most powerful influences on the novel is the infamous Scottsboro Boys case, in which 9 black teenagers were falsely accused of raping 2 white women aboard a freight train in Alabama in 1931. Like Tom Robinson, the Scottsboro defendants were met with mob justice, a rushed trial, and an all-white jury that quickly sentenced most of them to death despite a complete lack of credible evidence. This historical backdrop is essential for understanding the social and moral climate of Macomb, as well as the forces that shape Scout's evolving view of justice, fairness, and human dignity. An old town, but it was a tired old town when I first knew it. A line that reflects more than just physical wear. It symbolizes the town's moral and deep resistance to change. This atmosphere is not accidental. It mirrors the ingrained racial and social hierarchies that define life in Macomb. The town's structure is rigidly segregated, with white families holding the majority of power and status while the black residents are pushed to the margins socially, economically, and geographically. The article emphasizes that these inequalities are maintained through generational tradition and communal silence rather than violence. This passive complexity creates a culture where prejudice is so normalized that it can often go unchallenged. A reality Scout gradually begins to see as she matures. The town's refusal to confront its own injustice makes it a symbol of the broader moral failures Harper Lee seeks to critique To Kill a Mockingbird. Before the trial, Tom Robinson is portrayed as a hardworking, honest, and humble man who lived a quiet life with his wife and children in the black community on the outskirts of Macomb. He works for Link, a white landowner who later testifies to Tom's good behavior in court, stating that he never had any trouble with him. Tom is known for being respectful and kind, especially to Maela, whom he often helped with chores out of pity, not obligation. Tom's life is defined by limitations placed on him by a racially segregated society. Despite his integrity and work ethic, he is viewed through the lens of prejudice simply because he is a black man. His willingness to help Maela is ultimately twisted against him, as her false accusation leads to his arrest and trial. Tom's character before the trial reflects the quiet dignity of a black man in the South at the time, living peacefully, working hard, and trying to stay out of trouble in a world that is constantly watching them with suspicion. In To Kill a Mockingbird, the trial of Tom Robinson serves as a pivotal moment in Scout's moral development, marking her first profound encounter with systematic injustice. Despite compelling evidence of Tom's innocence, most notably his disabled left arm rendering him physically incapable of committing the alleged crime, the all-white jury convicts him solely based off of his race. Atticus encapsulates this miscarriage of justice when he tells Scout, "In our courts, when it's a white man's word against a black man's, the white man always wins." This stark reality shatters Scout's naive belief in the fairness of the legal system and highlights the deep-seated racial prejudices that pervade Macomb's society. The parallels between Tom Robinson's fictional trial and the real-world case of Emmett Till, a black teenager brutally murdered in the 1950s after being falsely accused by a white woman, reveal how deeply racism shaped public perception and judicial outcomes in America. Both cases illustrate how black men were often presumed guilty based solely off their race, and how white communities use fear and violence to reinforce their control. This comparison deepens the novel's critique of a justice system designed to protect privilege rather than pursue truth, showing Scout and the reader that justice and fairness are not always aligned in a racially biased society. This is a quiet but strong moral example in To Kill a Mockingbird. He teaches Scout important values like empathy, fairness, and doing what's right, even when it's hard. One of the most famous lessons is you really never understand a person until you consider things from his point of view. This idea becomes something Scout learns slowly as she grows up. Atticus does not just talk about doing the right thing, he shows it through his actions. Instead of shouting or enforcing his beliefs, he lives by them, giving Scout a real example of how to act with integrity in an unfair world. To Kill a Mockingbird uses the image of the front porch to show how people in Macomb stay emotionally and morally distant from one another. Near the end of the story, Scout stands on Boo Radley's porch and finally begins to understand his life by seeing the world from his perspective. This moment shows that Scout has grown and learned to empathize, something the rest of Macomb struggles with. Porches in the film often act as a space where people are close enough to watch others, but not close enough to truly understand them or take action. The people of Macomb often stay in this place of comfort where they could see injustice happening but choose not to get involved. They avoid real change by keeping their distance, just like standing on a porch instead of going inside of someone else's world. The porch becomes a symbol of how Macomb's citizens protect themselves from the uncomfortable truth of racism and inequality. Instead of challenging these problems, they stick to their traditions and pretend not to see what's wrong. This shows how the town is stuck in its old ways of thinking, unable or unwilling to move forward. Scout, by the end, takes a step many others won't. She chooses to see with compassion, showing the kind and moral growth that the rest of the town still resists. Scout's maturity is shaped by her ability to reconcile the harsh realities of Macomb's prejudice with the quiet moral strength modeled by her father, Atticus. Through her experiences, particularly the trial of Tom Robinson and her eventual understanding of Boo Radley, Scout begins to see the deep injustices embedded in her community. Yet, rather than becoming bitter or indifferent, she chooses to empathize in integrity. When she tells Atticus that exposing Boo Radley would be like shooting a mockingbird, she demonstrates a clear understanding of the importance of protecting those who are innocent and vulnerable. This moment reflects her moral awakening. Although she cannot change the world around her, she could choose to see it clearly and respond with compassion. Scout's growth is not about solving problems of Macomb, but about refusing to shape by its indifference to justice. One might ask whether Macomb is truly entirely blind to injustice, considering that few characters such as Miss Mowdy and Judge Taylor exhibit quiet forms of resistance. Miss Mowdy offers subtle support to Atticus and his values, while Judge Taylor appoints him to Tom Robinson's case, suggesting a desire for a fair trial. However, their efforts remain limited and largely ineffective in changing the town's deeply ingrained prejudice. This highlights how even well-meaning white characters operate within a framework that ultimately reinforces racial hierarchy. Rather than disapproving the argument, these characters underscore how rare moral clarity is in Macomb and how difficult it is for individuals to make a meaningful impact within a community that chooses silence over justice. In conclusion, Scout's coming of age in To Kill a Mockingbird is powerfully shaped by her direct experiences with injustice and the steady moral guidance of her father, Atticus. Harper Lee illustrates that moral growth is a difficult and often painful process, especially in society where silence and prejudice are the norm. However, it begins with the willingness to see truth. Through the devastating trial of Tom Robinson, her shifting perception of Boo Radley, and the quiet strength of Atticus, Scout learns that empathy and integrity are not just ideals. They are essential tools for navigating a flawed world. Lee ultimately suggests that confronting injustice may not always be loud and revolutionary. It must begin somewhere. And it often starts with an individual who chooses to see, understand, and act differently. Scout's journey reminds us that the change doesn't come easily, nor does it come all at once, but that moral clarity can take root even in the most resistant environments. In a community blinded by tradition and fear, Scout became a symbol of hope, a willing voice to acknowledge what others ignore. Her story urges readers to recognize the quiet beginnings of justice and to value the courage it takes to choose compassion over complacency. Thank you for all who came to watch my presentation, and you guys could use this time for questions or anything you have about this.